All right. Well, welcome folks to the SheJumps Alpine Development School. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you're just joining, please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know where everyone's calling in from and any goals you have for the winter. My name is Robin Gelfand. I'm the National Program Director for SheJumps, and I'm so excited to be here with you all tonight. Again, if you're just joining, please add in the chat where you're tuning in from. I'm joining you from Portland, Oregon, and would like to express respect to the First Peoples of this land. We recognize in the Portland metro area where I'm based that it rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Kaplamit, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. And I'd like to take this opportunity to respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future. And before we get going, I'd also like to take a moment to thank our partner Arc'teryx for their continued support of the SheJumps Alpine School program. Arc'teryx has been a tremendous partner to SheJumps over the years, and we're thankful for their commitment to the SheJumps mission. For those of you, this might be your first SheJumps event, welcome. And we're so happy to have you here. For our returning guests, we're equally as happy that you're here, and thank you for staying involved in the SheJumps community. SheJumps is a nonprofit organization that was founded by three friends way back in 2007. And the mission of SheJumps is to increase the participation of women and girls in outdoor activities. And it's important to note that SheJumps is an inclusive organization, and we welcome all women and girls, transgender and cisgender, as well as non-binary people. And over the past 16 years, wow, SheJumps has grown into a national nonprofit that hosts more than 150 events each year, serving over 6,000 participants annually. And we have a small staff team of 6, but we have over 150 amazing volunteers, a few of which I see you joining tonight. So nice to see you here. But over 150 amazing volunteers across the US who bring SheJumps mission to life in 17 states. And our volunteers are completely crucial and essential to the success of the organization. Did want to mention that we commit to having at least 35% of our events be free or low cost. And that's in an effort to reduce the financial barrier to make the outdoors more accessible to all. And one of the ways that we fund our events and programming is through our fundraising climbs. And if you're interested in mountaineering, you should definitely check out our fundraising climbs on our website. The link is at the bottom of this slide in pink, because we have 6 amazing climbs slated for 2024, and they're filling up fast. But participating in a fundraising climb is a really unique opportunity to not only raise money to support the SheJumps mission, to get more women and girls outside, but to be part of an incredible supportive group and climb an iconic peak with amazing guides. These all take place in the spring and summer of 2024, and as you can see here, you can choose between a Mount Baker ski mission or a climb of Mount Shasta, Mount Rainier, the Grand Teton, Mount Baker, or Mount Shikson. And if you aren't familiar with the SheJumps mascot, the Girafficorn, I would love to share a little bit about that. The Girafficorn is half giraffe, half unicorn, but all magic. It was designed by SheJumps co-founder Lindsay Dyer and represents persevering and keeping your head held high. With feet on the ground and eyes focused on where she wants to go, the Girafficorn stands as a reminder to keep the spirit of play and possibility alive when taking the jump towards our greatest potential. And if you're keen to sport some Girafficorn merch, please visit the SheJumps store, online store at shejumps.org/store, and buy some awesome merch to help support our programs. And it makes great gifts, I may add. All right, well, the reason you are all here tonight, I am excited to tell you about our guide tonight, Christine Feleki. Christine originally hails from Canmore, Alberta, and is now based on the west coast of Canada in Ucluelet, British Columbia. And we are so unbelievably lucky to have Christine leading tonight's Alpine Development School. Christine has co-guided our Alpine Finishing School on at least 6 separate occasions, And I had the pleasure of learning from Christine when I was a participant on this past year's finishing school course. And I will say that Christine saved my butt on more than one occasion. She's incredibly patient, knowledgeable, funny, and humble. And the whole team at SheJumps is honored to work with her. Christine has so many notches in her belt, but one that really stands out is that she is the first woman to obtain a full ACMG ski guide certification on a split board. So this is a huge accomplishment. We can hear it in the chat. And we want to acknowledge what a trailblazer Christine is. She's put so much time and effort into both the Alpine Finishing School and in creating and revising tonight's presentation as a stepping stone to take some of the finishing school concepts and make them more approachable to everyone, no matter where you are geographically or in your backcountry journey. So as we go through the presentation, please use the Q&A feature. We would ask that you use that feature instead of the chat to ask questions. It's just a little bit easier for us to manage. And Christine may answer a few questions throughout, but we'll likely save most questions for the end and have a dedicated 30-minute block at the end to answer those questions. And as a quick reminder, in case you do need to sign off early, we'll be sending out the recording from tonight's event, so keep an eye out for that. Also, since this is a longer presentation, we're going to have an intermission about halfway through. And at the end of that intermission, we will be selecting a winner from someone who's on the call tonight. You must be present to win, but a winner of an Arc'teryx Atom LT hoodie. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And without further ado, I am honored to introduce Christine Feleki.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you for everyone for being here. I think what's really cool about doing this still over Zoom is that we can get people from all over the place together, which is a nice way to be able to share the information. Robin, I just wanted to mention there's someone on the chat just saying that they're trying to sign in from an iPhone and they require a meeting or passcode. I'm not sure if you're able to maybe send that over to them while we figure this out.
Yeah, I'll jump on
and
that.
then as Robin mentioned, we'll be doing the Q&A at the end, but if questions come up, definitely feel free to write them in the chat at any time, and then it's probably easier to get to them at the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to get started here. So thank you again for the introduction and welcome everyone to the Alpine Development School. I am really hoping that tonight is going to spark your excitement for the winter coming and also give you some food for thought. So we're going to get started here. Winter backcountry travel is complicated. It's full of uncertainty, and that fulfillment, joy, and excitement that we chase can come at a great risk. The backcountry is an ever-changing environment that is affected not only by the weather, but also by the people who recreate in it. And as we strive to gain experience, we take on more risk. And even with the most careful and prudent planning, we could still have the worst case scenario happen. So tonight we want to kind of figure out how can we stack the odds in our favor. We'll explore the realms of managing risk, choosing terrain, and decision-making for winter backcountry travel, and try to answer this question as we go along. When I'm thinking about how I manage risk in the backcountry, decide on appropriate terrain for the day, try to make those millions of decisions that we have running through our heads, 4 words come to mind, and overwhelmed sometimes is one of them, but usually I try to focus on strategy, forethought, discipline, and flexibility. Strategy is our plan. It's the training and thoughtful consideration of how we will approach the day or put our trip together. So to put it another way, it's the risk management we put into place to achieve our goals. Forethought is the effort that we put into the plan. It's going to include things such as gathering information before the trip, which will help aid decision-making by preparing us for the potential hazards, terrain, and even possible human factors we could encounter throughout the day. And it's going to allow time for us to logically think through things. Discipline is having the courage to stick with the plan and follow the rules in regards to terrain and safe travel habits, despite any temptations that could arise and push us to take unwarranted risk. And lastly, for all our planning and discipline, we know the backcountry is riddled with uncertainty, so we need to be flexible. Having the ability to pivot while still managing risk and making safe decisions is going to be key to our success as we travel throughout the backcountry. Success is achieved through practice and dedication, curiosity, strategy, and building a pre-plan. It also includes having the ability to communicate between our partners and making time for self or even group reflection. And all of this will result in an experience bank to fall back on, making our decision process quicker and more adaptable when we do not need to take, and which will help us not have to make those on-the-spot decisions. So how do we actually build strategy, forethought, and discipline into our backcountry process? To start, we're going to go through some definitions. So we need to understand risk management. By definition, this is the act of assessing, minimizing, and preventing accidental loss or harm to something of value by implementing safety measures. With risk, we are always weighing the reward, and the reward is why we risk. Realistically, risk management is something that all of us do in our everyday lives. We're constantly assessing. You're way ahead of me there, Robin. We're still on the risk management slide. There you go. We're constantly assessing whether we realize it or not, how likely our chosen course of action will result in a poor outcome and therefore not be worthy of our efforts. When we head to the backcountry, there's no difference here. We envision our objective and then decide if given the conditions, can we actually succeed? The goal here is, again, to minimize our chance of being harmed in the mountains. Ideally, we're trying to match the management strategy to the amount of risk involved. So we want to consider things such as having the appropriate gear, who our partners will be, selecting the right terrain given the conditions and our abilities, and even possibly backing off something if we realize it's not the day for it. If the stakes are higher and you're choosing an objective that is at the upper end of your ability level, the more strategy, forethought, and discipline will need to be applied. And we will need to we will now need to consider if it's worth the risk. Risk is defined as exposing something of value to danger, harm, or loss. The mountains themselves are full of hazards, but until we actually expose ourselves to those hazards, there is no risk involved. The simplest risk management strategy we have at our disposal is to avoid. So just don't put yourself in harm's way. This is probably often one of the first learned risk management strategies we learned when you take a beginner avalanche course. We likely all had a moment when we look back and realize how foolish and lucky we've been and how we now know better. Again, those of us with those introductory avalanche courses, such as AST1 or RE Level 1, probably remember feeling a little scared about the backcountry travel once we realized all the things we actually didn't know. I know I remember and even cringe at some of the previous mistakes that I made in my decision making, which is good. It's a really important part of the process is having this reflection, and because it allows us to bank those experiences for later use. But it's important to think that when we're new to something, we really can't rely on our experience. So to counter this, we need rules and reasoned thinking based on facts to keep us safe. This allows us as new backcountry users with little experience to still go out, have fun, and be safe. Just stick to simple terrain, avoid everything else. And as we grow, the idea is to hopefully attain new strategies to deal with terrain by continually gathering information to aid our decision-making and gaining mentorship, which will grow our experience bank. Eventually, we're going to seek something more, or maybe we're pushed by our peers or asked to do something that we might not be comfortable with. And in this situation, we found our risk tolerance. So risk tolerance is the degree of risk you as an individual are willing to undertake in order to reach a goal. Everyone has their own level of risk tolerance, and it should not be a source of judgment towards yourself or others. It's just what it is, and it's going to change throughout the day, the year, or the month. The real important thing here to remember is that you're going to want to talk about your risk tolerance with the people that you choose to venture into the mountains with. Choose partners that your risk tolerance align with, and try to discuss this with each other on kind of a trip basis. So if you're having an off day and want to choose an easier objective, it's a good idea to speak up and say so. Sometimes we're going to want to go fast and light, and sometimes we might want to take selfies and eat snacks while we're out there. But the thing to remember is risk tolerance will help us recognize where we could find or be vulnerable. Vulnerability is our likelihood of being harmed. So assessing your vulnerability as a group or an individual means considering the ability of you and your group to manage the hazards you will encounter on your trip. This means considering things like your fitness, technical ability, knowledge, and what kind of training everyone has. So, for example, if part of the trip might include skiing or being exposed to a big cornice while you're skiing, then you need to consider the vulnerability of you and your group in that sort of terrain. Does everyone in your group have the technical skill to actually ski through that piece of terrain quickly and efficiently? If the answer is no, then it means your vulnerability is potentially high. The longer your group spends exposed to the cornice, the higher chances you have of being hit by that cornice. So efficiency and technical ability would be very important in this kind of instance. Even if only one of you is a weaker skier in the group, this is going to increase the entire group's vulnerability, as it potentially increases your exposure time, which means the time each skier will spend hanging out under the hazard. So you want to consider your objective or figure out an appropriate way to manage or mitigate the cornice hazard. Ideally, you might have already planned for this ahead of time. And maybe this means you choose to leave earlier so that you're under the cornice when the temperatures are cooler. Maybe you're possibly skiing this or traversing this hazard one at a time, or you've decided to avoid this line completely as it's not the right objective for the group or the day, depending on skill, risk tolerance, and conditions. Being honest with yourself and your group about the individual and group vulnerabilities is important, and this will help choose appropriate objectives for yourself and your friends once you're out there. The biggest enemy we find to effective risk management is the ego. So we really want to try and leave that out of the equation when we're dealing with vulnerability. Where am I here? Objective hazards. When we talk about risk management, we're always thinking about what is the hazard and how will I manage it? The definition of a hazard is a potential source of danger. Danger can come in the form of objective hazards, subjective hazards, or both. Objective hazards are hazards that exist on their own, whether or not you are nearby. Things such as rockfall, crevasses, icefall, cornices, and severe weather would fall into this category. Subjective hazards are hazards that are human-caused. Choosing objectives outside of your skill level, allowing yourself to become dehydrated, getting lost, maybe overexerting yourself, would all fall into the subjective hazard category. And then, of course, some of these hazards could fall into both. So a natural avalanche would be an objective hazard, but a human-caused avalanche would be considered a subjective hazard. To manage these potential hazards, it's common to use a layered approach. The more layers, the more protection you have. There's a theory that is used in risk management called the Reason Swiss cheese model of accident causation. It's a mouthful, which describes risk management as a series of barriers to protect you from the inconsistent, unpredictable, and unintended weaknesses of an individual layer. You have a series of risk management layers in place, but they all have holes in them. And no single layer can protect you from everything, which is why it's important to have several layers of risk management, making it harder for all those holes to align. The Swiss cheese model basically suggests that when the holes in your risk management layers do line up with one another, that's when an accident occurs. So to put it another way, we can compare it to maybe getting dressed for a cold, sunny day. I know in the morning or in shady places and when we stop for breaks, I'm going to be the coldest. But if I were to wear only my warmest jacket and pants with no room for adjustment, I will be a hot, sweaty mess when I get to that break spot after working hard on the uphills. And this could result then in myself becoming even colder at the lunch spot or in the shade. So to counter this, I choose to wear layers that I can adjust throughout the day. Layering allows me to manage the risks associated with becoming cold. It will help me conserve energy and avoid the very worst case scenario of possibly getting hypothermia. Building layers into a backcountry risk management strategy just does the same. It begins with the pre-plan. Pre-planning not only plans the route you want to take, it's going to plan the backup plan if things are not what you had expected. It helps you visualize the terrain you're heading into so you can plan accordingly. And it checks out the weather and avalanche conditions and determines your timeline for the day. It discovers the hazards and cruxes so you can create a strategy to deal with those in advance and plans for the worst if something should happen. I think of pre-planning as my sidekick for every adventure. Everything on the list on the screen here is a risk management layer that can be pre-planned. Other important overall risk layers of management to consider are things like taking courses to gain knowledge and technical skills, possibly seeking out mentorship, doing post-trip debriefing sessions to learn from each trip, and even simple things like making sure you're eating well and getting enough sleep before you head out on the trip. The act of pre-planning actually allows room for flexibility. You will be alleviating your stress levels before and during your trip and be more able to think on the fly or more intuitively because you have more information going into the situation. So to begin pre-planning, we need to start by gathering information pertinent to the objective, effectively answering what has happened, what will happen, and what don't I know. As said before, not all of these decisions need to be made in the moment, so we can formulate some of our decisions at home to help us relieve the stress before we get into the situation. So even if things don't go according to the plan, we're going to be better prepared than if we had absolutely done nothing and just showed up blindly to take on the objective. So my first question, what has happened? This question helps us understand the nature of the snowpack we're going to be dealing with. You're seeking information regarding previous precip amounts, temperatures, wind, snowpack layering, recent or maybe standout avalanches. And depending on your objective, you want to be looking for information from the previous night, maybe the previous week or months or season. To find this information, search out your local avalanche bulletins, weather stations, remote telemetry. Places like highways and ski hills often have these things, webcams. Social media accounts these days are getting pretty good. And even your own previous observations from when you were last out, or those of people you trust or who are experts in the area. And another helpful data point can be previous historical data on avalanches from years past, especially if you're going to go into maybe lesser traveled places. Having this historical knowledge of where things commonly avalanche can just be super helpful in your pre-planning. Question 2, what will happen? This question is this question is partially answered by asking what has happened. As what happened really helps us shape the avalanche forecast. So if you're in a remote area and don't actually have access to avalanche bulletins and weather forecasts, what has happened will be the information you use to come up with your own forecast. Weather directly affects the avalanche forecast. The snowpack it's always good to remember that the snowpack does not like quick change. So any kind of large or dramatic inputs will likely increase your hazard. If you do have access to a weather forecast, this is going to allow you to further predict the hazard trend for the day and give you a reference point to base your actual observations from once in the backcountry. And I think understanding the trend is super helpful when you're trying to predict what will happen. Once you've determined your avalanche problems, trends, and likelihood for the day, you can then determine the appropriate terrain to match. So before we jump to the third question, we're just going to kind of classify terrain quickly. So choosing terrain, which I find to be the really fun part, I think trying to match the objective to your group's ability before you head out is super helpful. So consider things like your group size, vulnerability, risk tolerances, and overall goals, and then consider the type of terrain that might coincide with that. So again, thinking about the weather and avalanche forecast and how these factors will affect specific terrain features you might be dealing with. And and then at this point, start to consider not only terrain from that macro level, but also on a micro level. So this means like specific terrain features that may be suspect, such as convex rolls, gully features, or cornice ridges, which we're going to dive into even further into our presentation. But to start with, it can be super helpful to give terrain a generalized terrain rating of simple, challenging, or complex. This makes it easier to align ability and risk tolerance with conditions and uncertainty. These ratings are known as the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale and are compiled using 11 terrain parameters. But the really cool thing about the 8 rating is a lot of popular ski tours are starting to have this already rated. So when you're doing your research, you can kind of search ahead and be like, what kind of trip am I getting into? Is it simple, challenging, or complex? So just quickly, we'll go through each of these terrain categories. So simple terrain is relatively low angle or primarily forested terrain. So you're thinking slopes of 30 degrees or less. Simple terrain has some forest openings and may involve the runout zones of infrequent avalanche paths. And you'll find many options are here to reduce or eliminate exposure to avalanche danger, and there will be no glacier travel required in simple terrain. Once we move into challenging terrain, the risk goes up. You're now exposed to well-defined avalanche paths, start zones, or terrain traps. In challenging terrain, options still exist to reduce or eliminate exposure to avalanche terrain with careful route finding, and any required glacier travel is going to be pretty straightforward, but crevasse hazard still may exist. And lastly, we have complex terrain, which now involves exposure to multiple overlapping avalanche paths, large expanses of steep open terrain, multiple avalanche starting zones, and terrain traps below. Minimal options exist to reduce your exposure in complex terrain. Complicated glacier travel through extensive crevasses or ice falls may be required when you're traveling in this zone. By setting an overall terrain guideline, you can really help limit your terrain choices throughout the day, making the decision process easier later on. Once in the terrain, you can then apply that more specific terrain restriction you have placed on the features identified as most likely to produce an avalanche for that day. And my last question for pre-planning here was, what don't I know? With a general idea of where we might go, we should ask where our knowledge gaps exist. So how much uncertainty are you heading out the door with? This line of questioning can help set an overall mindset for the day. Most of this information will likely be found while you're out on your adventure, but by thinking ahead, you can begin to plan how and where you might find your answers. Are you walking maybe into the unknown? Have things changed dramatically since you were last out? Maybe there's a weak layer you don't understand, or uncertain amounts of new snow, maybe wind effect, or even temperature or solar effects out there. Perhaps you have been out daily on a traverse or lodge trip and are feeling fairly in tune with your surroundings, but there's been a slight wind change overnight, or now it's spring conditions and you're kind of letting that spring diurnal pattern direct the flow of your day. What I'm trying to say here is by questioning what you are missing, you can avoid being lured into complacency, which is a really dangerous place to be. So the second step in our pre-planning is going to be route planning. So once you've got your objective in mind, it's a great idea to have a written form of your plan. A route plan should contain any information you would want to know if you had to navigate in the very worst conditions, which I think of as whiteout navigation. So scour through trip reports, guidebooks, satellite images, photographs, get out paper maps, use software like Gaia GPS, CalTopo, Fat Maps, Google Earth. There's tons of options out there these days. And you're going to find through the process of route planning, you're going to become very familiar with your trip before you've even headed out. Cruxes, gear needs, and discussion points can be predetermined and presented to the group so everyone will be on the same page. And it's a really easy way to make sure the whole group knows to spread out across a slope, or where we want to put on a harness or get the rope out before we're traveling on a glacier. I find this as well can be an excellent way to ease your own anxiety as you start to prepare for your upcoming trip as well. So just quickly, a route plan. For me, this is kind of how I lay mine out. I commonly have several different data points, the first being the legs, and legs represent a period of time between points when travel is difficult. A period of time between points. So if travel is difficult due to bad weather or terrain challenges, it makes sense to break each of these portions of your trip up into more manageable bites. So on the route card here, the leg would be the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. My second data point is going to be my start and end points. And so each leg can then be identified by either a coordinate, a place name, or elevation, or some sort of description. I like to keep track of my elevation gain and loss, which can help determine travel time and prepare you for what is ahead. And a known elevation can be super helpful if you're trying to figure out exactly where you are on a map, or if you're not tracking yourself on a GPS or your batteries have died or something like that. It's also nice to have a distance. So how far are you going to go for each leg, which again will influence your travel time estimations. And it can again help aid in navigation and your pre-trip preparations, because you're going to get your time planning and figure out, what do I actually need? How long do I plan to be out there, etc. Time estimation, as I just said, it's going to help plan the food and gear you might need, how long you plan to be out in the elements, and maybe determining something like a turnaround time, and keeping track of are you on track with your route plan, or have you fallen behind? I also include bearings when I do a route plan. So by determining my compass bearing before I head out, can save quite a bit of time before you get into the field. So if you do find yourself in a whiteout and you're on track, you can just pull out your route card and set your bearing on your compass and just start traveling in the right direction. Bearings can also be super useful in kind of green out navigation. So if you're like in the thick forest and you can't see anything, and it can sometimes also be helpful to note the back bearing as well as your forward bearing. And I also like to leave a space on my route plan for comments. And this is just where I make notes for those specific portions. So is there a hazard I want to be ready for, a place I plan to maybe dig, or I want to eat lunch at, or we want to spread out, those kind of things. And so to help with time planning, I find this chart super useful. There are definitely several ways out there to estimate time, but I find this one easy for myself. And to get better at estimating time, it's a good idea to take note of how long things actually take versus what you had estimated, so you can adjust for the next time that you're out. And it's really important to not forget to account for breaks when you're actually calculating your trip times, because if you don't add in those 5-10 minutes, you could end up being out there way longer than you estimated and kind of be caught off guard. So, basically what we're looking at here is if you're on a good trail, or it's easy trail breaking, or there's already a trail broken, you're going to move fairly fast. And sorry, this is in kilometers, but it's about 4 to 5 kilometers per hour. Once the trail braking starts to get harder, you're probably going to slow down to 3 to 4K an hour. And if you're getting into complicated route finding, maybe you're having to scramble, it's really steep, it's bushy, anything like that, that time is going to drop significantly to about 1 to 3 kilometers per hour. So that's kind of your horizontal distance that you're calculating there. And then on top of that, you're going to add an hour for every 1,000 feet, or every about 300 meters of elevation gain. So you have your horizontal distance, and then you add your vertical distance to get your time estimation. Once our route planning is done, it's time to get to packing. Having the appropriate gear is part of risk management. Besides your transceiver, probe, and shovel, what else do you actually need to have in your pack? At the minimum, I think it's important to be prepared for an emergency. So be it avalanche, injury, or having to spend the night out. Consider who you need to contact in case of an emergency, and try to have that pre-programmed into your devices. And don't forget about your own personal self-care. So it's things like sun protection, warmth, and your own energy needs. And it's a good idea in general to carry the following. We call it the 10 essentials. So within the group, you want to have some sort of navigation tools, a map, but you can't really use a map without a compass. So map and compass have to come together. An alternative, not an alternative, an altimeter is a really helpful, useful tool. And then a GPS device. And, these days we're carrying our phones and GPS devices and pretty much doing most of our navigation off of those. But if those fail, which they do, it's really nice to know that you can still go back to a map and compass and be able to route find. I do a lot of my pre-planning on the map, and so I still carry it with me, and it's really easy then if I have to pull that out. I've already looked at it so much, I know exactly what I'm looking at once I'm in the field. Item number 2, headlamp. And if you're going for, a long time, you might want to consider extra batteries, or these days, if you need to bring like a charging battery for your headlamp. Sun protection, so sunglasses, protective clothes, and sunscreen, especially in the springtime, or basically anytime after February. I find the sun's getting pretty harsh. First aid kit, including, especially if you're someone who gets blisters, pack extra blister care. Gear repair kit, and we all have a lot of different bindings and gear out there these days. So if you have, differing kits, maybe you have to bring something specific to your splitboard setup or your ski setup, that might not be considered group gear. It's nice to have a fire kit of some sort. So some way to start a fire if you needed to. And then depending too on how long you might get caught out, having some sort of little pot so you could melt water if you needed to is a nice add-on if you were to get caught out for the night. I always carry some sort of shelter. So this could be those lightweight emergency bivvies. It could be a big tarp. As a guide, I often carry this Alpine Threadworks tarp, which also can be converted into a toboggan. So if I had to pull somebody, it's not going to pull them for hours, but I could pull them to, a flat spot where I could get a helicopter to get them out of an emergency or something like that. Communication devices, these days, we have lots of options now with these kind of satellite messengers like the InReach, the Spot, the Zoleo, those kind of devices. But satellite phones can be super, super useful, as well as radios, and then cell phones. But a lot of places don't have cell coverage after a certain area or like a certain place. So just make sure the cell phone isn't the only thing you're bringing out there. And then it's always important to have extra food and water beyond what you're expecting to need, as well as extra clothing beyond what you might need. So it's all good to have one puffy for yourself, but what if someone gets hurt and we need to give them some extra clothes and you still need to keep yourself warm? So just being mindful of yourself plus the needs of maybe having to take care of somebody else. Beyond the 10 essentials, again, everyone does not need to carry the entire 10 essentials. We can pass some of these items out in like first aid kits or repair kits, which would be considered group gear. But beyond those things, consider specific gear that you might need for the trip you're planning. So are you going to be traveling on a glacier? Are you doing some sort of steep snow climbing, or even more ski mountaineering style objectives? Are you planning to do an overnight? What would you need to accomplish those tasks? And the idea here is to layer our risk management strategies again. So bringing what is appropriate for the size of group and the size of day, but it's also inappropriate to bring everything in the kitchen sink, because the bigger and heavier your pack is, the slower you will go. And sometimes, sometimes being too slow on your objective is actually dangerous. So there's a balance of bringing what you need and not bringing more than what you need. All right, step 4 of the pre-plan, I think of as the human element. So giving thought to who you're headed out with and how many of you are going to be out in the mountains together. So the size of the group changes how you will operate in terrain and can make certain hazards harder to manage. Your group size affects the efficiency of your travel up and down, and it increases your exposure and vulnerability to hazards. In complicated terrain, emergency situations, or when making difficult decisions, the amount of people can have both a positive or negative effect on the outcome. The human factor can add to the complexity of risk management. Countless case studies show that although people had made a plan beforehand to avoid a specific piece of terrain, excitement, new snow, or some other human factor swayed our better judgment and they skied it anyway. As humans, what I've noticed is we can be unpredictable, emotional, impulsive, opinionated, self-confident, or overconfident. Self-conscious or overconfident. And on the other side, we could also be thoughtful, logical, calculated, patient, calm, curious. The list goes on. And to compound these things even further, we change our minds quickly, and we're also easily influenced, which can unconsciously sway our decision-making process. These biases can come from within us as well as from external sources. Add in decision-making in a group dynamic, and the challenges can really escalate quickly. In order to make a decision, the human brain needs to take in information, process it, and then make a decision. And we basically have two types of thinking systems that work independently or together to come to that conclusion. One process relies on intuition, emotion, and our subconscious. It's known as the heuristic process. And the other method is utilizing reasoned thinking, which is a more rational, logical approach to decision making. So to start with, heuristics, which is also known as our intuition, is a thought system that enables us to make quick decisions based on repetition over time. It's basically like a shortcut for our decision making based on our own personal experience, our habits, and our biases. It's often the type of thinking we refer to when talking about human factors, and it tends to be more hands-on or based in trial and error, where the rules are kind of loosely defined. Heuristic decision making is interactive, subconscious, quick, instinctive, and emotional. We use this thought system daily to fast track small decisions. So things such as red means stop and green means go. But if we're not paying attention, these shortcuts can backfire and often catch even those more experienced off guard as we become complacent. Managing our heuristic thought involves considering where our rational thought could be overwhelmed by our own personal biases. Considering human factors in your planning has been proven to help with decision making in the moment by keeping our egos in check. So the common human factors we face that could influence our decision process in backcountry travel can be remembered by the acronym FACETS. And again, it's important to think that these are not always a negative, but the ones that I'm talking about here are what have commonly been brought up in case studies as reasons why people got themselves into trouble. So the first F is familiarity. And this is relying on our past experiences to guide our behavior in familiar settings. Familiarity can allow complacency in our decision making to take over rather than relying on the facts. So something like, I always ski this line and have never had an accident. Acceptance is the idea that our need for acceptance by others kind of overtakes. This could play out as someone willing to take risks in order to gain respect or be accepted by their peers, or going along with something despite our misgivings. C stands for consistency, so maintaining consistency with the first decision that we made. The idea that you or your party are so committed to the goal or that you're blind to any signs telling you to turn around. The desire to be consistent actually overrules critical new information about an impending hazard. E, we're going with expert halo here, so deferring all our decision making to someone who is perceived as the expert or leader. Always think, why was this person chosen to be the leader? Do they actually have the training and experience to be in this position? And what if you happen to notice something they do not? I find in this kind of scenario, being able to communicate with each other is the key. So just be willing to speak up if you're unsure about something. T stands for tracks, but we also sometimes call this or describe this as scarcity. It's or FOMO, the fear of missing out. So, we go touring for the fresh POW, and the lure of no tracks or pressure to get somewhere before it gets skied out can be super strong. Making decisions to ski something because that is where the fresh line is not really good decision making. We need to think of things such as terrain selection based on slope steepness, slope aspect, slope shape, and avalanche potential, not a rush decision that you need to ski this before the person beside you does. And our last on the facets acronym is S for social facilitation. So this is similar to acceptance, and this human factor plays on our need to show off. So the presence of others can make us believe we are safer than we possibly are. We might also, kind of get that bragging, like wanting to brag or Kodak courage. And especially with the rise in social media, we see this more and more. So don't make decisions based on getting the shot. Do your homework and get the shot safely. And again, this is not an absolute list, but many of these factors have been identified when looking back at avalanche incidents. And more recently, we've been talking about another heuristic, which is kind of described as the intersectional heuristic or an identity bias. So the identity bias, also known again as intersectional heuristics, addresses the power imbalance, dismissive attitudes, and othering that can happen when those of marginalized identities are the minority in the group. So this is not only gender-based, but also gender identity, race, and class-based. By creating an inclusive and encouraging environment for everyone to share opinions, concerns, and observation, the group benefits by ensuring a diversity of thought and experience is actually brought to the table. And I think this is a really important bias that we're now bringing into the talk when we're thinking about human factors, because often it's probably one I hear without even realizing it the most, of like, you know, I'm the only female in the group, I'm the only you know, the new person in the group, I'm the only one of this race or gender identity in the group, and then you feel like you might not have as much power or place to maybe speak your opinion. So I think it's a really important human factor to identify when you're out there. All right, moving on to the thinking systems. So the second thinking system, so we just went through the heuristic side of things. So on the opposite side of this, to balance out our intuitive process, we also rely on reasoned thinking. This thought system is conscious, logical, methodical, and rules-based. It's best for situations with high uncertainty where multiple options might exist, sudden or unexpected changes in weather or conditions happen, or if your observations show different results than you had been anticipating. Reason thinking is going to be a major player in the planning process, and it will aid in the intuitive decision process we find ourselves making once we are in a situation. Both heuristic and reasoned thinking make both of these processes are effective tools, and they both have their downfalls. But when something is new, it's going to be better to rely on reasoned thinking, which allows you to weigh multiple options, practice different techniques, learn from your mistakes, and be open to feedback, and allow even for reflection in the process versus that kind of gut feeling intuitive process. So as you gain experience, your pattern recognition will develop, and your decision-making process will then become more efficient and intuitive as a result. And hopefully you'll also become more aware of your own biases in the process. Naturally, we are going to have a desire to progress as well. So we don't always want to stick to simple terrain. So the question also becomes, how do we know when to start stepping up our decision making? We can't always stay in our comfort zone. Progression in itself is a process of trial and error, learning from others and from our own experiences. But the big danger in the backcountry is if we do move too quickly above our skill set, the consequences can be super harsh. And there is the very real possibility that we may not get a chance to learn from our mistakes. So I just wanted to take a look at the conscious competence learning model, sometimes also called levels of mastery, to help define the learning process into 4 stages. The first being unconscious incompetence. So when we first try something new, we are unconscious of what we don't know. We're naive, incompetent, and often happily oblivious or even unaware of any potential dangers that could be out there for us. We have no idea of what we're in for or how things may end up. Conscious competence is the second stage. So as we start to learn the new skill or about our surroundings, we begin to gain consciousness. At this stage, we are still unable to perform the task, but we understand and actually see the value of why we should do this in the first place. So to begin to learn, we may try out different ways to proceed and have failures along the way. We may also seek out mentorship and take courses to actually start gaining an understanding of this task. Conscious competence happens once we have learned the skill. We have actually become consciously competent. We now understand how to do something and can carry out the task, but it still takes effort and concentration. And we may even lapse back if we bump into any sort of struggle or something that takes away from our attention. And then lastly, we have conscious incompetence. So the final stage, we've actually mastered the skill and can easily perform this task even under high stress. It's basically second nature. So you can do this skill while doing something else, or you're able to teach the skill to somebody else. So an easy example to think about would be like the first time you transitioned on your new backcountry setup. Though you got your setup and you probably were like, how the heck does this even work? Um, there's moving parts and where do they need to move to? And you bang on things and you kind of, fiddle with them and it doesn't work so well. And then you might get somebody to kind of teach you. Maybe you take a course, an intro course, and you slowly start to gain knowledge of this skill. And then finally things start to click and you're starting to be able to transition pretty quickly onto your like into downhill or uphill mode, but any sort of distraction and you find that you're about to ski the line in walk mode still, or maybe your skins are still on, or if you're a snowboarder, you put your bindings on your wrong feet. But eventually you find that you've hit the last stage, unconscious competence, and you will be able to transition calmly, be done and have time to eat a snack and actually help somebody else out or take some photos at the top of the run. The thing to be worried or not worried, but still conscious of is complacency in this process. So often progression cycles will look like a series of waves. So as you gain the skill and knowledge and understanding, you're riding up the back of that wave. And at some point, some sort of event will happen that will bring you back down, possibly lower than you were ever before. So this major downfall is often the result of a big mistake, which can be really hard to work back up from. The ultimate goal is to ride a wave that only dips down slightly as we learn and make mistakes. Overall, the wave continues to rise, and we want to kind of avoid the big shore pounding event, which is much harder to recover from. So to do this, we need to step out slowly and incrementally increase the challenge, which all comes back to how we manage our risk. So remembering that risk management stacks the odds in our favor. You may deem an objective worth the risk. This is going to be your personal choice, but recognize that every time you take on risk, you are increasing your chances for something to go wrong as you increase your risk tolerance. You've upped your exposure and your vulnerability. Risk management is a process that helps us make good decisions in a highly unforgiving environment. If we go back to the beginning of this presentation, we talked about the need for strategy and forethought to begin the process. During the initial planning and information gathering stage, we begin to make decisions from our safe, warm home with lots of time on our side. And as we transition from our safe, warm home, where much of our process was spent on strategy and forethought, we enter this dynamic mountain environment. Here we need to be both disciplined and flexible to continue to make those safe choices. So as we're getting ready to go out, check in with your partners and make sure everyone is on the same page. Has everyone done their homework, have all the gear they need, feel good about the conditions and the plan? You should feel comfortable communicating as a group, even if you may not agree on everything. Once you're in the field, the communication process becomes way harder. So again, having a bit of a strategy in place can help with the difficulties. So we're going to take 5. And when we come back, we'll transition kind of from pre-planning and into decision-making with terrain in mind. And I think Robin is going to then announce the winner of our Arc'teryx jacket once we're back. So I'm going to run to the bathroom and be back shortly. Oh, there we go. How are we doing here?
Great. As folks are starting to come back from our intermission, we are going to pick through a random number generator the winner of the Arc'teryx Atom LT hoodie tonight. So I'm doing a random number generator right now. And that number corresponds on our participant list with Alexa Millward.
Nice.
Alexa, if you are still present, please throw a note in the chat, and then I'll send you a private message to get your shipping info. Congratulations, Alexa. Yay, woohoo! Congrats, Alexa. I'll send you a message to get your shipping info so we can send you this Arc'teryx jacket. And then Christine, I know there are a couple questions now. Would you prefer to hold those till the end?
I answered a few quickly, but we can touch on them quick. One was just, is a transceiver the same as a beacon? And yes, it is. The transceiver is the technical name, and beacon is kind of just the more common name that people use, but it's the same thing. Another question I saw was, for altimeters or elevations, am I just using like my watch or my phone? And I use both. So I will use the altimeter on my watch, but I'll also check it off my GPS device, which could be on my phone or on another device. The one thing to note is that a watch altimeter is generally using or kind of assessing elevation based off of barometric pressure. So if you're having big changes in weather, that pressure can actually change the elevation on your watch. So it's one way to know, like, if there's a big pressure change. So if the pressure is rising, your elevation usually drops, and that's, so then you've got a high pressure coming in. You're like, oh, the weather is going to be clear, but then your watch may be off. So just making note when you're at a known elevation, or checking it with the GPS from time to time and just making sure that it's still right. And then there was another question here quickly from Hillary. What is the name of the book that Christine refers to? Page numbers and chapters. I don't know if I might need some clarification there, Hillary. I don't think I was referring to a book, but perhaps it was something I was talking about. An idea I was talking about. If so, maybe just, a little clarification. Some slides have page numbers on them. Really? Let me look quickly.
It may have been this slide right before the break, the daily process from Avalanche Canada.
Oh, yes. So yes, that is, so our Canadian Avalanche Association here in Canada, who puts on our avalanche courses, so our AST 1 and 2, they have their book, and this is a photo from that book. So it's just like the accompanying literature for our avalanche courses. Oh, the Freedom of the Hills one. Yes, thank you. So that was quite a ways back, talking about risk tolerance. Freedom of the Hills is a classic kind of mountaineering book that describes a lot of our, do I have it right here? No, I don't have it right here. It describes a bunch of kind of technical mountaineering technique for the mountains. It's quite a thick book, but it's got a lot of great information in it. And so that would be, and yes, you can buy it. Freedom of the Hills. Let me just see. I don't know what they've done quite a few iterations of it, so I don't know what they're on anymore. But
can folks buy the Avalanche Canada book?
Yeah, I think if you went to Avalanche Canada, you could probably buy that from Avalanche Canada directly. You get it if you take an AST course. AST 2 course, it's part of their AST 2 curriculum. I can't remember exactly what they call that book. I'd have to look it up. But I think if you went to the Avalanche Canada website, they probably would have Probably would be willing to sell a book. All right. Probably been about 5 minutes and we still got a lot to go. So I might dive back in if people are ready. Sounds good, Robin?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So welcome back. So just to recap the first half of our presentation, we're mainly kind of dealing in pre-planning for risk management and decision making. And for our second half here, we're going to dive more into terrain management and how we can use it to manage risk and make decisions. So to start with, let's imagine we're now at the trailhead and our pre-plan is actually being put into action. I like to remind myself to be an active participant in the backcountry. So continually monitor what's happening with the wind, precip levels, temperatures, and the effects of maybe solar radiation or just heat temperature on the aspect that I'm on. So pay attention to what aspect you're on. Note if these weather inputs are increasing or decreasing your hazard, or are things actually just staying the same. Again, pay attention to the route plan and don't be swayed by the human factors. We made specific plans to deal with the hazards that had been forecasted. So try to stick to the plan unless something is trying to tell you that you need to change your process. So if you begin to find the forecast seems incorrect, you need to gather more information and adjust accordingly. Throughout the day, I like to ask myself, what is happening now? Start in the morning when you look at to see what the changes have happened. When you look to see what changes have happened overnight, and then continue to update that information as you make observations throughout the day. So perhaps that morning, 5 centimeters of new snow has fallen, and between waking up and driving to the trailhead, another 10 started to accumulate. The wind overnight was light southwest, but again, by the time you reach that trailhead, it picked up to moderate, and the temperatures hovered around, say, -10, so like 14 degrees Fahrenheit, but have now warmed by 5 degrees. What can we start to assume from these observations? Personally, I'd be thinking my hazard is rising, and I would also be questioning if this is something I had expected or not. If not, how am I going to adjust my plan for the day? Hopefully, I've pre-planned already for safer objectives. And if I'm also dealing with something like a persistent weak layer, my concern would be even greater for worry now of larger avalanches becoming possible rather than just maybe a storm slab or wind slab out there. This all, again, leads to the question of what will the appropriate terrain be for the day? So understanding terrain and how to use it to your advantage trumps almost all other avalanche skills. And I'm just moving forward on slides there, Robin. And as we move through the mountains, we are moving through the physical features that make up the landscape. So wind, precip, sun, and temperature are all going to interact with these features differently, depending on their aspect, slope shape, and steepness. There are shapes out there that are more likely to cause an avalanche and shapes that are going to offer us more protection. Some shapes will often have differing snowpack problems based on their aspect or exposure to the elements. And at a glance, it seems easy to identify these terrain shapes, but in reality, it can be a lifelong journey to actually really hone those terrain assessment skills and interpret the effects that time and weather have on these features. So to help us, we're going to create a bit of a cheat sheet of basic terrain shapes and features that we deal with in the backcountry and how they often what we can expect with these features. What I find with having a terrain strategy is it helps us to develop confidence when we approach unfamiliar areas. So there's a saying out there that terrain repeats itself. So once you understand the terrain in your immediate area, you can often assume that similar patterns will arise around the next corner or on similar aspects in the zone that you're in. Terrain strategy also helps avoid complacency in familiar areas. So this goes back again to that familiarity human factor. So don't get caught off guard when the storm blows in from the opposite direction. So if, prevailing winds are normally southwest and it comes in from the north, you don't want to go and jump into the same terrain features you always do. Terrain strategy is going to help reduce stress on yourself in new situations. It gives you rules regarding terrain shape that you can always rely on especially if things are uncertain. And terrain strategy is an ongoing process, so refinement and reflection are going to be a part of this. And this refinement and reflection is going to be how you actually grow. So don't assume your day was a success just because you made it home. I always try to ask myself, did I get lucky today? Could I have made a better decision somewhere? Did it work today, but maybe that decision would not work every time? And the most important was, where was I most at risk? And could I have done anything differently, or did I manage the risk well? So our first feature we're going to start with is a convex feature. So when we talk about convex features, we mean a slope shape that kind of rolls over like a basketball. The terrain is steepening as it drops, and we often refer to these features as unsupported, meaning there's nothing supporting the terrain feature from below. So this can include things like cliffs. Convex rolls have increased slope stress and tension in the snowpack, making them very likely places for avalanche initiation, especially at the point where the slope begins to roll over. So before the angle steepens, gravity is pressing the snow straight down into the slope. And as that angle starts to roll over, there's no longer anything to support the slope, and the gravity that was pressing is now pulling down the slope instead. This invisible line is known as the area of tension or stress, and is the most likely place, again, to initiate that avalanche. Convex rolls are difficult and dangerous to traverse, and they do not typically provide easy or safe track setting. So when you're trying to assess the snow conditions on a convex roll, if you are putting yourself on that line of tension, you're already committed to the slope by the time you reach the stress point. And the shape of the convexity makes them likely places for wind slab or store slab and melt freeze problems to initiate from. So the next few slides just kind of highlight convexity. So when we look at this picture, we can kind of see a lot of deep shadows, and depending on the time of day and picture, it changes, but the shadows do offer us a clue as to where a lot of this unsupported terrain might be hanging out. So circled in blue right at the top, at the ridge is a slab avalanche that was triggered breaking immediately below the roll over the ridge right at the convexity. So this avalanche could have been natural or human triggered, I'm not sure, but my guess is it was likely a wind slab, so formed by snow depositing over the edge and forming a wind slab here. And when the right trigger came along, the avalanche initiated. So generally speaking, we say it's a good strategy to avoid large convex features, especially when you're track setting. And a rule of thumb to remember is, if you can't see over it, don't ski over it. If you do make the decision to ski over a convex roll, just be really aware that the terrain is essentially offering you no protection from the weaknesses in the snow pack, and can be especially dangerous if the snow has slab properties. So try to look for alternative routes whenever possible. From this photo in pink here, we can see a more supported line to the looker's right of the avalanche. This terrain feature offers us protection due to its slope shape. Of course, the size of the feature as well as the aspect plays a big role in our terrain selection. So large convex features can have high consequences if an avalanche is triggered. Very small convexities can be great indicators for snow stability, and a great place to assess storm snow instabilities with very low consequences. So often when I'm out track setting, I will purposely try to cut across the tension line on small convex features to gather information about how easy or how likely I am going to be able to trigger a slab on this type of feature. But it's really important to remember, when levels of uncertainty are high, it's wise to avoid all large convex features. We always want to try and give ourselves options within the terrain. So opposite of a convex feature would be the concave feature. So concave features are slopes that are more dish-shaped, and I like to think of it kind of like that classic kids' playground shape. We would commonly refer to this feature as a supported feature. Concave features tend to have less stress and tension in the snowpack than convexities, as gravity continually pushes or presses into the snow slope rather than pulls. So it is important, though, to be cautious where the concave feature begins. Often the top transition of that feature can be convex, and in this case, then the concave section is the runout zone or the avalanche path for that convex slope. So as the slope angle decreases, avalanche debris can pile up and again act as a terrain trap, which increases your consequences of being caught in an avalanche. Again, due to the change in shape, concave features may create altering snow conditions due to exposure to sun and wind. So we should always be on the lookout for any sort of change in snow as you're moving through it. We often talk about slope shape as supported or unsupported. And as stated before, these features can kind of run into each other. So at the top here, we have our convex shape pulling down into the concave shape. When we last saw this photo, it was circled with all the convex features. Looking now, we can see that the riders were able to link the supported terrain features to work through the terrain without hitting any of the big convexities here. So when assessing any feature, size, angle, and aspect are going to be key to consider to understanding avalanche potential. And it's important to always consider what's above you, so your overhead hazard, as well as what the run out zone looks like. So where would the avalanche go if it does slide? Concave features help support the terrain above by the compression created with the shape. That being said, a large, steep concave slope still has the potential to avalanche, and the low angle terrain below would act as a terrain trap, catching the debris. So avalanche potential, or you still have to consider your avalanche problem when you're assessing a slope shape. Our next shape is a planar slope. So planar slope is basically featureless in the sense that it's all one angle. And because of this, the potential exists for large slope propagation. So large planar slopes must be assessed carefully for going up or down them. The nice thing about a planar slope is that the featurelessness of them makes it very easy to track set. So we often seek out these kind of slopes to put our skin track up. And small planar slopes are easy to manage and can provide really great skiing in a lot of different conditions. So as said before, a large planar slope that is steep enough to avalanche can be a really terrifying place to find yourself. So if you were to trigger a slab avalanche on a slope like this, it has the potential to go wall to wall, as there is nothing to break up the terrain. So the size and angle of that planar slope, again, is really key when you're deciding whether or not to travel on it. In this picture here, we have a reasonably sized planar slope broken up by a small rib of rocks on the looker's left and ending in a bench that allows the skiers to regroup away from the slope. The slope angle is consistent and featureless, which is why we call it planar. Again, another planar slope. So in this picture, we have a short planar section near the top of the slope that can then changes into lower angled planar terrain. And this makes the top section easy to manage by, you can send people down this one at a time, and just making sure that you don't stop right underneath that steeper section. You ski well away from it into where it gently scoops out at the bottom of the slope. Moving on to benched terrain. So benches are any kind of shallower angle portions of terrain above, below, or in the middle of a slope. They will dissipate stress and tension in the snowpack as they provide a break in the angle of a slope. Benches often provide the least amount of resistance to traverse, and therefore they are really great places to try to set your skin track. They can also be deceptively steep, of course, and in that case, they would not make a great place for setting your skin track. And while we often like to use benches as roadways, there may be hazards above and below. So if you're going to be stopping on a bench or maybe using it to cross terrain, consider how wide it is and how far away from the slope above you are able to be. And also what might be underneath that bench. If it were to avalanche, what could you get pushed into? So while large benches may provide safety from avalanche terrain, it's not always the case. Instead, they could act as a terrain trap because of that transition angle. With all things, it always depends in the backcountry. So benches often define what we call the grain of the terrain. So when you start to analyze terrain, you'll notice that most of the time the benches on a slope will all tend to kind of head in the same direction. And if you can recognize this, you can use that as an advantage when you're setting your skin track and connect bench after bench to easily work through something rather than going against the grain, which will make you feel like you're really fighting that terrain the whole way upslope. So the safety and ease of travel on benches, again, really depends on the size, shape, and steepness of the slopes above and below them, and the size and steepness of the benches that you're using themselves. But if you can kind of pick those features out, it can really make track setting a lot easier. So examples coming up here, we have a bench across the valley here on the sunny slope, and it's commonly traversed to access bowls on the backside up where that rocky peak is. It's quite a wide bench, but you do have quite a bit of overhead kind of hazard above you that gets sun. It's west facing. And so for this piece of terrain, you might consider spacing out and be really sure that nobody is kind of cutting high above you on that bench while you're crossing it. Next photo, this bench is less obvious. It's sloped and has significant consequence if an avalanche actually initiated, as it's going to sweep you over the cliff. So if you're deciding to take something on like this, having appropriate spacing, as well as continually monitoring the snow as you go across would be really prudent. And in this case, I'm taking the photo and my friend is out front and we backed off. He found a feature or wind slab in there that he didn't like, and we decided not to keep going. Benches can also be used on the way down, so we don't only use them on the way up. So here we're traveling through glaciated terrain, so a lot of these benches might actually be kind of crevasse bridges, and we can see how the bench terrain was used to kind of traverse safely between crevasses and navigate through this complicated terrain, connecting the areas of safety and good skiing as you went down the mountain. Okay, our next feature is a rib feature. So a rib is a vertical ridge that runs downslope. It tends to confine your track setting, especially as you get higher up, which forces the terrain feature to become narrow. And this results in more effort and less efficiency as you're forced to maybe do a lot of kick turns or maybe even eventually switch to boot packing. They can create cross slope tension due to changes in aspect and changes in snow depth. And wind loading on one side of a rib is known as cross loading and this can create tricky avalanche conditions to manage. Because on one side you might have kind of a scoured side and on another it could be quite loaded. Often by staying on the rib, you're on a high point, and this can offer protection from avalanches by kind of providing a barrier to what we call cross-slope propagation, and I am going to talk about this more later on. However, with the right avalanche problem and a stiff slab, that rib feature may not protect you. So the pros and cons of ribs really, again, like all slope features are going to depend on the size and slope angle associated with them. So narrower and steeper ribs will provide less safety and be more difficult to travel on, especially while your track's setting, so going uphill, than wider low angle ribs, but they're often really great places to descend. In this next photo, we can see kind of an example of what are kind of more gentle rib features, and these high points in the terrain again can be great places to avoid the troughs where avi debris can run through. So the trees are actually kind of growing on the ribbed features, and the troughs or the gully features are where the avalanche is going to slide through. And our last rib photo here, in this photo, it's a large size 3.5 avalanche that crossed over several terrain features. And this central kind of middle rib feature, although quite large, would not have protected you from this avalanche if you had been standing on it and it came down. Okay, gullies. So a gully is a water drainage feature. They can be difficult to exit once you're in one. They can find track setting as well due to the sidewalls on either side, and they funnel avalanche debris or slough and act as a terrain trap. So similar to ribs, they create cross-loading features along their sidewalls. So one side again could have less snow and the other side could have more. So it's really important to think carefully about placing yourself in a gully feature. Once you've committed to this feature, they can be very hard to escape from. And they are, again, the main throughway for snow once it begins to slide. So these features can be wide and mellow up high, but as you descend, the sidewalls become larger and steeper, making it more difficult and more dangerous to exit the gully at this point. Good navigation skills can really help you avoid becoming trapped in these features, especially once you're kind of down in below tree line terrain and you're getting into those really steep, narrow kind of river or creek bed features. They can be awful to be stuck in. Next slide here. So gullies are also known as couloirs or chutes, and they can be fun to ski, but the previous warnings still apply. They are avalanche paths with no escape. So consider how you'll enter this terrain. Do you plan to climb up it or ski it from the top? By climbing up the feature, you can become very in tune with your snowpack. However, you're in the line of fire the entire way up. And conversely, by going in from the top, you're less exposed on the way up, but you are clueless to what the snow conditions might be once you enter that chute or couloir feature. So it's, again, just something to consider. Couloirs, so again, very important to consider what the consequences of an avalanche will be in this kind of terrain feature. Are you able to escape? What does the run out look like? Does it end in a cliff or a bergschrund? Is it rocky or does it gently taper into a wide open field? Consider where and how an avalanche might initiate. And are we dealing with cornice fall, wind or storm slab, or is there a persistent weak layer lurking? Or maybe even like on this photo, we've got these kind of hanging slope features. So on the sides there's these cliffs with hanging snow features that are getting sun. So, you know, if you hit the tipping point where the sun actually initiates an avalanche on one of these hanging features on the sidewall, it's going to all funnel into that gully. So just kind of being aware of that as you make your decisions on that kind of terrain. Okay, moving ahead, ridge crest. So a ridge crest is not exactly what we call a basic terrain shape, but it's still a worthy terrain shape to mention. They are the height of land feature where there is no more terrain above you. So this does not mean necessarily that you're on the summit, but rather that the terrain descends on either side of the feature. And a ridge crest often leads to the summit. We tend to gravitate towards these features as they offer us protection from avalanches, as they have no overhead hazard, and they can be really great vantage points and often can just be a destination in themselves. Keeping in mind that ridge crests are places where the snowpack transitions, again, from deep snow to shallow snow, which may mean that a person could trigger an avalanche more easily once you're moving off of that ridge feature. They also tend to have both a lee and windward side, as well as a side that is more sun exposed. So the snow conditions on either side of the ridge can really vary. And our last terrain shape here is the cornice, and cornices, you know, realistically is an avalanche problem, but they seem like a terrain feature. So we can expect cornices to form where the terrain is kind of gentle on one side and steep on another. And the gentle side is known as the fetch zone. So when wind travels up that low angle slope, it's going to push and move snow with it. And the snow is then rushed over the steep edge, and that's how the cornice is formed. So if you're traveling on a cornice ridge, you really want to be sure to give cornices a wide berth, as they can crack off and pull back quite a far ways onto onto the terrain. So making sure that you're not walking right on the edge of that cornice. And the ridge line underneath those cornices could be quite serrated. So you might think you're on rock and you could just be on open air. So keeping a probe out when you're dealing with a cornice is a really great idea. And if you're going towards the edge at all, consider possibly building an anchor and belaying yourself over to assess things rather than just walking out there blindly. I always try and get a look at cornices from other angles as I'm like well before I'm at that feature. So I'll be looking at it from below, or if I can get a view from it from an angle to get an idea of how overhanging it is, and just see what I'm dealing with before I'm actually at that feature, and not just like blindly standing on top of it, not realizing I'm just, standing on air basically. Okay. So it's often said that you can't trust the snowpack, but we can rely on terrain to be our constant. So by understanding terrain, we can head out and use these features to our advantage to travel safely through the backcountry. Understanding terrain allows you to form what we call good travel habits. So good travel habits will help us deal with the unexpected. By forming these habits, we will automatically default to safe practices, which make our decision making that much easier. Normal caution is how we travel all the time in backcountry terrain. Normal caution includes good communication within your group, making sure to regroup within a safe spot, having an escape route planned. So, when you're assessing a slope, if this is going to avalanche, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? Using terrain wisely, so understanding those terrain shapes and using them to your advantage, and actively looking for instabilities and isolated slab avalanches. And be especially cautious if anything is listed in the avalanche bulletins about deep or persistent weak layers. When we find ourselves in more challenging or complex terrain, dealing with higher avalanche hazard or feeling uncertain, we want to actually practice what we call extra caution. So extra caution is going to be having that detailed trip plan, the skill to route find and navigate even in whiteout conditions, being able to evaluate slope stability, having the ability to manage your friends through terrain on the ups and downs, being practiced in your rescue skills, and also being able to perform wilderness first aid and having a plan for when that kind of emergency happens. So if terrain is our constant, avalanche potential is the variable. So likelihood, consequence, vulnerability, and exposure are all words we use to describe risk, as well as how we forecast for avalanches. So understanding how an avalanche problem may react will help us to decide how to interact within the terrain. In general, we have several types of avalanche problems. Those that initiate on the surface or near the surface, such as loose wet avalanches, loose dry avalanches, wind slab, and storm slabs. And those that are buried deep within the snowpack, such as persistent or deep persistent slab avalanches. And then we also have those that kind of are on the outside of these categories, such as wet slab, glide slab, and cornice failure. So in general, the likelihood of loose snow, storm slab, wind slab, and cornice failures can be somewhat easier to predict. They are all initiated by a sudden change, like a rise in temperature, wind, or precip amounts, and will usually settle down within days or weeks. Glide slabs, wet slabs, persistent and deep persistent slab avalanches are way more difficult to predict. They are often below the surface, such as a buried persistent weak layer, and the consequences are generally higher due to their larger destructive potential. So we're going to dive now a little deeper into avalanche problems to be able to understand those and how they, and then be able to relate those to terrain. So first up, dry, loose avalanche happen within new snow or surface facets that lack or lose cohesion. So this type of avalanche is predictable and will only last maybe hours or days, and generally produce avalanches up to size 2. If it's associated with facets, so it really cold snow, the problem can persist a little longer, and those avalanches can run farther downhill than you might expect. And you can expect this type of avalanche to follow terrain downslope. So it's going to kind of flow like water in the terrain, like it'll be directed through or the easiest path. It'll flow downhill in the easiest path it can, is what I'm trying to say there. These kind of avalanches are often called slough, and managing this problem is best done by avoiding terrain traps where avi debris can concentrate, as well as being conscious of your overhead hazards, such as steep terrain where sloughs may initiate. And consider your exposure over cliffs where a small avalanche could have a large consequence if it were to push you over that feature. So wet loose avalanches are the result of warmth being added to the snowpack through air temperature, wet snow, or rain and solar radiation. This problem will persist until the temperature cools off again. So watch out for gullies and confined features and heat stores such as rocky outcrops or cliff features. Aspect is going to play a really important role in how hot a slope is getting. So be mindful of the aspect that you're on and what is above you as you're crossing it. Both wet and dry loose avalanches are commonly called sloughs, as I said before, and these avalanches can trigger slabs that move down slope. So they might start as these kind of point release avalanches, but then that actually could initiate a slab avalanche somewhere downslope from it. Okay, storm slab avalanches are a result of intense precip and often wind. They are short-lived avalanche problems initiating within the new snow or at the old snow interface. So it's a generally widespread problem, and the slab itself is described as very soft to medium hardness, which would correlate to fist or one finger snow when you're determining resistance in a snow pit. Management of this problem is avoidance of all avalanche terrain within the first 24 to 36 hours of a storm. So once in the terrain, be on the lookout for signs of instability such as cracking. And storm slabs can be really tricky as the slab can be super hard to actually feel, but it quickly becomes reactive. So when I am dealing with storm snow, I often abide by what I call the 30-30-30 rule. So if there's 30 centimeters of snow or more, and there's a weak layer 30 centimeters down, I'm going to avoid all slopes that are greater than 30 degrees or close to. So again, if there's 30 centimeters of snow or more, if I'm dealing with a weak layer that is also 30 degrees down, I'm avoiding all slopes that are 30 degrees or close to 30 degrees. Wind slab is formed by wind moving snow from the air or across the ground and depositing on the leeward side of terrain features and obstacles. They are most unstable when they first form, but they do persist for several days and maybe a little longer if it's cold out, like quite cold out. Identifying wind slab is done by looking for sudden changes in texture and stiffness of the snow. So feel the snow as you're moving through it. Has it changed? Is it cakey, hollow sounding? Are you seeing shooting cracks? If you flip your pull over and kind of press the handle of it into the snow, is it consistent, or is there kind of a concerning change where it goes from maybe stiffer to less stiff as you press through the layers? This I find is a really good problem to do a hand shear test for if you're kind of looking for a way to see that slab. Just doing a quick hand shear is great for wind slab. And wind slab can be very soft slab to very hard slab. So it has a hand hardness from forefinger to knife in resistance if you're digging your pits, and it can still be reactive once buried, but this problem remains in the upper snowpack or on the surface of the snow. Avalanches of this kind will run in isolated or specific terrain features or down a path. They will be found in the lee of ridges, ribs, or gullies, and sometimes can surprise you farther downslope when the winds are really high as they push snow kind of down and through terrain. So common places would be kind of on glacier rolls and convexities farther downslope in alpine or tree line features. Cornices are large, dense, wind-deposited snow masses that, as we talked about before, project over steep ridges and drop-offs in terrain. They are another hard-to-predict avalanche problem because they become touchy when temperatures change. So when temperatures change or when rapid loading due to wind and precip occur. So they're hard to predict in that they could happen at any time, but they're more likely to fall when temperatures change, either from cold to hot or you get a lot of snowfall. Cornice fall can create its own avalanche or initiate a secondary avalanche due to the force it exerts when it lands. So setting anything off from a wind slab to maybe even a deep persistent layer. And while we often find warming temperatures release cornices, cold temperatures can change the snow composition at the base of the cornice and destabilize them as well. So it's just a good idea to stay out from under cornices. And again, keep a wide berth if you're traversing on the ridge lines with them. You really want to be sure that you're on solid ground. we can always assume any quick change to the snowpack will likely cause an avalanche. Okay, moving into persistent slab avalanches. These are the result of weak layers that are actually forming on the surface of the snow and then becoming buried. So usually loading happens slowly over time until a max load or threshold is reached and an avalanche results. So weak snow crystals and layers are comprised of facets, surface hoar, or combinations of facet crusts or surface hoar crusts. The problem with these snow crystals is that they are slow to change, or what we say is heal, once they become buried, which can result in an avalanche problem that lasts for a long time and can really, unfortunately, reload with new snow, which kind of perpetuates that avalanche cycle. When talking about slab stiffness over a weak layer, the layer is going to range from soft to hard, which is recorded as 4-finger to pencil, and can result in avalanches up to size 4, so really big. This layer will be found in the mid to upper snowpack, and the problem can last up to 6 weeks long. Persistent slab problems are complex. They're difficult to assess, manage, and predict, and they typically are confined to specific aspects or elevation bands, but they can sometimes be widespread. Tracking and identifying this weak layer and its distribution are going to be the key to dealing with the problem. So keep notes of any instances and timing, and go out and dig for this layer in safe locations. Leave yourself a large margin for error and keep your terrain choices conservative when you're dealing with this problem. In the same line is deep persistent slab avalanches, and these form early in the winter and are the result of weak snow layers forming deep within the snowpack with a thick, hard layer of cohesive snow over top. So typically this layer is comprised of facets adjacent to like an early season ice crust, maybe depth hoar forming at the base of the snowpack, or facets on the snow glacial ice interface. So from summer snow and glaciers having facets laid down as kind of in that when the initial snowpack for the winter is starting. It's common to refer to the base of the snowpack as the basal layer, and this is where a deep persistent slab is going to initiate. This problem will produce avalanches and then become dormant, but not gone. So it's going to wake up again to initiate another cycle, which can continue to turn on and off throughout the winter, and then often will create the biggest avalanches again in the springtime. The slab hardness is medium to very hard, so 1 finger to knife, and can cause avalanches up to size 5. And these avalanches will run within the avalanche path or cross into adjacent paths. So this is that idea where you could both persistent and deep persistent avalanches could cross slopes, not just being confined to one feature. Similar to persistent slab avalanches, weak layer tracking and a wide margin for error are essential. So this problem may even cause you to avoid specific terrain for an entire season. Both deep and persistent slabs can produce wumping, cracking, and remote triggering, which are all signs that facets, surface hoar, depth hoar, and combinations of these with a crust might be present. Wet slab avalanches happen during warm-ups. Either rain or warm air produces a dense wet slab avalanche that will be slow moving as it runs through terrain. As soon as the temperatures drop, the problem will disappear. If the temperatures continue to warm and or maybe it possibly continues to rain, the snow eventually will turn into slush, losing all cohesion and slab properties, and you won't have that problem anymore. So this problem happens at any level within the snowpack, and it's often associated with facets or depth hoar. The slab itself can be soft to hard, wet grains from 4-finger to pencil. Avalanches of this type are going to stay confined to a path. And this particular avalanche problem is time sensitive. So immediately after warmth impacts the snow is often when the avalanche is going to initiate. So you really want to pay attention to time of day, time of season, and sudden changes in temperature. So rapid warming. Moving on to glide slab avalanches. So glide slabs resemble kind of a giant crevasse, yet they're not on a glacier. They tend to crack open in places where there's a smooth bed surface, such as grass slopes and rocks, like smooth rock slab. And here what's happening is the water can run freely between the ground surface and the snow interface, which causes the entire snowpack to glide downhill. And at the base of that snowpack is usually a mixture of facets and wet grains. And the top layer of the snow is kind of moving faster than the lower layer, which is kind of creating that cracking open. The slab will ultimately glide open, leaving a full depth crack, and eventually a full depth avalanche will occur. The resulting avalanche will run within its path and can be anywhere from medium to very hard snow, so 1 finger to knife hardness, and large avalanches can result, so size 3 to 5. Glide cracks do not mean immediate release, but you can see these kind of features hang on for, months, weeks, whatever, and then all of a sudden they decide to go. And predicting when the avalanche will happen is pretty much impossible. They are really easy to see and easy to avoid, so just stay off slopes with guide cracks, or don't ski into them, don't ski underneath them, kind of thing. Sorry. So when we're making decisions about terrain, it's really important for us to consider the propagation potential of an avalanche. So this is directly related to the type of avalanche problem you're going to be dealing with. Watch out for wind slab and deep or persistent slab problems such as facets and surface hoar, as they have the potential to link terrain, but don't underestimate storm slab potential or wet slab avalanches, which can do the same. The stiffer the slab, the more propagation potential there is. Propagation potential is how far or wide the crown of a slab avalanche will travel. To understand this, we need to understand tension within a snowpack, or how well bonded the snow is, as the bonds between individual grains are what help keep the snowpack together. Snow crystals bond better when they are small and rounded in shape, kind of versus big and sharp. So essentially what's happening is friction is holding one layer to another. And as weight is added to the snowpack, it's going to start to stretch that snow. If the bonds are strong, gravity and weight will not overcome the friction or resistance between those bonds. Tension in the snowpack can be affected by 3 factors, which will increase or decrease the bonds within the snow. These bonds will react to pressure, temperature changes, localized weaknesses such as persistent layers in the snow, and the added weight from snow, rain, heat, cornice fall, or avalanches, or potentially even us. When we speak of propagation potential and cross-slope tension, we're talking about 2 things. How strong is the bond within a slab, and how strong is the bond of that slab to the layer beneath it? A stiff or well-bonded slab over a weak layer has a large propagation potential. So for example, when we're looking back at this picture, we see the rib slope. There is potential for cross-loading on the slope. The snow will be thicker in some places and thinner in others. Weak layers beneath the snow are going to be easier to trigger where the snowpack is thinner, which sets the stage for cross-slope propagation when combined with the stiff slab. These are mouthfuls. In other words, an avalanche is going to be able to basically link or cross this terrain feature rather than be confined to one terrain feature. So in this photo, the avalanche crosses over a ribbed feature and pulls snow down both gullies and through the rib. When looking at terrain, I always like to think back to what the avalanche hazard and forecast were for the day. So let's say the forecast was moderate in the alpine tree line and low below tree line, with wind slab listed to size 1.5 in the alpine on specific features and isolated features at tree line. I'm now looking up at a convex tree line feature and can gauge, based on the forecast and my own observations, if I were to initiate an avalanche here, how far could it run and how wide could it be? And I can then decide, is it an appropriate place for me to ski down or not? Within terrain as a whole, we travel through 3 different elevation bands: alpine, tree line, and below tree line. So each of these bands are associated with their own characteristics that can either help or inhibit our safety. It's important to read the avalanche bulletin to understand both the hazard rating and the avalanche problems associated within each of these elevation bands, because this is going to help you pre-plan terrain that will be appropriate for the day, or perhaps places we want to avoid completely. So recognize that each elevation band has some unique attributes that require certain risk management strategies. Elevation bands are not set at a certain footage. They're recognizable more so by their character. So below tree line is in the forest. I usually kind of think of it as the place I could easily hide 100 people. Often we hang out below tree line when avalanche conditions are higher. Tree skiing can be really fun to do, especially on a stormy day when the skiing is good in the trees and the visibility is poor at higher elevations. However, below tree line is not immune to avalanche problems. Storm slab and persistent weak layers can initiate here, as well as you may cross avalanche paths that run from mountain top to bottom, exposing you to dangers that are well above you. Open spaces within the trees, like cut blocks, could harbor specific avalanche problems, such as surface hoar, and creek gullies can entrain avalanche debris and run long distances. A common mistake people make is to overestimate the protection the trees provide us from avalanches. So in order for the trees to actually have real anchoring effect, they would need to be spaced so tightly together that it would be really hard or almost impossible to ride through them. So if the trees are open enough to ski through, they are open enough to avalanche. One of the real reasons I think that one of the real reasons I think tree skiing is often safer than skiing high during a storm is because the trees offer a lot of protection from the wind. So it may be that there are wind slabs forming at higher elevations while the snow remains low density in the trees. And as stated before, the treed areas are often the kinds of places where surface hoar crystals tend to form. So if you're skiing through the trees and you kind of pop into an open meadow, this might be the spot where the surface hoar got laid down, and this open spot could also be now potentially exposed to wind, and now you have a slab sitting over surface hoar. So just be really cautious when you are in the trees and you kind of pop out into openings, especially in BC here. You know, we have lots of cut blocks or thin spaced trees that have been cleaned out from avalanches or fires, or if you are crossing into a low elevation avalanche paths. These are all places where the conditions might be very different from what you were just skiing when you were in the trees. So even though you're below tree line, just be mindful of this. This kind of information might be represented in a public avalanche bulletin by showing higher hazard below tree line with less hazard above. And this is not common. So if you do see this, it should really pique your curiosity as to why that might be happening. And one thing to mention, yeah, we're still below tree line there, Robin. There you go. So while not avalanche related, navigating in the trees and keeping your group together is another risk management consideration when traveling through this elevation band. So while traveling up or down, maintaining visual contact with a major feature can be a good navigation strategy. So I'll look for prominent features such as ribs or maybe kind of shoulders or something like that I can identify easily on a map, and that's going to help me navigate through the terrain. When I'm skiing down, regrouping in large openings, although it could be dangerous, is a good place for other people to see you. So hooting and hollering to each other is a good strategy. And when it comes to trying to keep your group together when you're skiing in the trees. I like to try to come up with a plan early on, like a strategy. So maybe the first skier is going to set the line, and the next skiers are going to stay close to the line, and you're going to be calling back and forth to each other. And if you don't hear the people behind you, stop, because maybe they've fallen over and it's all good, but maybe they've fallen into a tree well, and then, you know, that could be a really big disaster. The big thing to remember is that we are our best rescue. So if we're really spread out and we can't communicate, it's going to be that much harder to get organized and rescue someone from a tree well. Okay, moving on. So tree line terrain. Tree line terrain, I think it's really important to recognize that at this stage, you're going into a transition area. So you're moving from dense forest into more open terrain, and you're going to be closer to the major start zones and the alpine. As well, the snowpack is more exposed to the elements, which can make for variable conditions. So just be on the lookout. One of the most important changes is watching for wind effect. It is likely that this elevation band has seen more wind than below tree line, which can result in wind-loaded areas, wind-scoured areas, and wind slabs. Tree-lined terrain can be some of the easiest terrain to navigate due to the fact that visibility is going to be less restricted than in the dense trees. An added bonus is that in poor weather, you're going to be less likely to experience the true whiteout conditions that you would get up high in the Alpine, as the trees are going to help provide some visual reference. So Alpine terrain. Alpine terrain is the terrain above tree line. There are no trees here. The terrain in general is going to be more complex, and it is the most exposed to the elements. You're going to find added terrain hazards such as cornices and glaciers, and you tend to be exposed to the really big start zones. Thin to thick snowpack variation is more common in the Alpine, as wind is going to whip up one side or across a slope and deposit it elsewhere. In general, snowpack and terrain hazards often compound here, and lurking deep persistent layers like facets and depth hoar can be really hard to manage. So if we only mastered one element of backcountry travel, being able to identify what is avalanche terrain would be the most important skill set. The relationship between avalanche hazard and how it interacts with terrain is a much harder relationship to build, as there can be so much we don't know or understand on any given day. There is always going to be a degree of uncertainty with regard to the snowpack. Forecasting the likelihood of an avalanche is a best guess fueled by the evidence we have gathered. And the question then becomes, how good is our evidence, and do we have enough to be confident? The best way to counter the uncertainty is to understand terrain and use it to help manage the risk rather than to add to it. So I'm just going to kind of finish my presentation talking about uncertainty. I know for myself, when I first started backcountry touring, it seemed as though every day needed extra caution. I'd come to realize all I didn't know, but really lacked structure and experience to feel comfortable with my decision making. Where do I go? How do I stay safe? Am I afraid for real? Or is it just because I don't know? These thoughts would kind of swirl around and really cloud my judgment, and uncertainty would creep in, and I would ask myself, how is it possible for me to even make a safe decision when it seems like everything is out to get me? So the fundamentals of winter backcountry travel suggest that taking avalanche courses, developing a good understanding of snow science, snowpack tests, how weather relates to the snowpack, and so on are going to be crucial to our safety. But the reality is the snowpack is not something you can assess with absolute certainty. There will be days in the mountains when our level of certainty regarding the strength of the snowpack is high. For example, when we're in the middle of a good melt freeze cycle in the spring, we can be pretty certain that the snowpack is relatively stable, at least while it stays frozen. Our confidence will also be higher during a storm cycle, when we can be sure the snow stability is relatively poor. During times of higher certainty surrounding the snowpack, it's easier for us to make confident terrain choices. Where it gets really tricky is when uncertainty becomes higher, and realistically, avalanche forecasts have a high degree of uncertainty most days of the season. The forecasts often sit at moderate or considerable avalanche hazard, and these ratings are inherently ambiguous, and they don't always trigger our alarm bells. If the forecast can be interpreted differently by everyone involved, it opens the doors to more uncertainty. So when we have more uncertainty with regard to the strength of the snowpack, we need to hedge our bets by choosing appropriate terrain and gathering more information. Professionals often state that there are many days in a winter season when they have low confidence in the snowpack, and they therefore choose terrain with smaller consequences or a lower likelihood of producing avalanches. They're going to avoid terrain that magnifies the consequences of being caught in an avalanche, such as terrain traps and convexities, and they will build in margins for error even when the avalanche hazard is sitting at moderate or low. And persistent weak layers offer a great example of how to deal with uncertainty. They require patience and diligence, and they are not a surface instability. They are buried beneath the snowpack, lurking where we cannot see them. So sometimes we will receive obvious feedback with numerous avalanches happening, and then other times they lay dormant, waiting for the scales to be tipped, and we just have no idea when it's going to happen. Typically speaking, when a persistent weak layer first gets buried, there is an avalanche cycle. After this initial avalanche cycle, the avalanche activity tapers off. And unlike the storm and wind slab avalanches, these persistent weak layers will continue to produce more avalanche activity. that continues for some time after the weak layer is buried. And so usually what happens is there's kind of these tipping points. So, you know, after your first 30 centimeters of snow, you might see that avalanche cycle happen. And then it doesn't happen again until like 30 or another 30 or 40 centimeters of snow pile up on top of that layer again. And it kind of depends on the density and of that snow and the weakness of the layer, and it gets kind of complicated. But yeah, eventually it kind of goes in this cycle of activity to no activity to activity. These avalanches become less frequent and more difficult to predict as the time goes on and the layers get buried deeper and deeper in the snowpack. And as they're buried further down, the consequences ultimately get higher as the destructive potential of these avalanches increases. So when we're dealing with an avalanche problem like this, you will hear professionals talk about high levels of uncertainty or low confidence despite the avalanche hazard rating possibly being kind of sitting at moderate, maybe, or considerable. You will likely also read of low hazard, high consequence avalanches stated in the public avalanche bulletins. So this is where terrain selection really can come into play. So thinking back to our terrain cheat sheet, what can we assume? Large, planar, and steep slopes of any kind should be avoided. Convexities are going to be very likely to trigger an avalanche. Terrain traps such as gullies, cliffs, and flat spots or benches directly under avalanche terrain should be avoided. And consider what is above you. So cornices, unsupported features, or the potential for step down avalanches in this scenario. What does that actually leave me with? Firstly, I'd be thinking back to my terrain categories, and I'd be looking for simple terrain. And within that terrain category, I'd be looking for small, manageable slopes that are broken up by benches, slope angles of less than 30 degrees, concave features, no overhead hazard, and I would be trying to track where the persistent weak layer is not, and I could ski that terrain. So choosing the terrain that is appropriate to both the conditions that you are seeing and your level of uncertainty takes a lot of practice. I would really urge you to actively participate in this learning process and not blindly follow people around in the mountains on the assumption that they know, on the assumption that you think they know what they are doing. The truth is, none of us know for sure what the outcome of the day will be, not even the professionals. So instead, we need to stay diligent and continue to stack the odds in our favor by applying strategy, forethought, and discipline while still being flexible in decision-making and terrain choices. So if you're unsure of what you're dealing with, I'm trying to tell you to dial it back. We do this by applying terrain knowledge and appropriate terrain selection in combination with what we do and don't know about the snowpack on a given day. This is going to increase our chances of staying safe in the mountains. Ultimately, making decisions in the backcountry will never be perfect. There will always be risk and uncertainty. We can't know it all, just as we can't remove all the risk. What we can do, and what I strive to do, is have the best information we can to base my decisions off of. So to do this, you must continue to be curious. Positive feedback does not always reflect good process. So question those decisions, your track setting, your terrain selection, and make sure you do celebrate when you feel like you've done the best you could with the information on hand. Someone once told me practice makes permanent, so keep chasing lines, new places, and familiar ones too. And each day out is an experience you can use for bettering your process down the line. Work on progress, not perfection. You're going to make mistakes, but having the ability to recognize an error and change course, I think, is one of the most important qualities. This will keep you from plowing ahead into compounding consequences. And remember to be reasonable with yourself. If you're new to backcountry skiing, set small goals and work on your skills before you start to push out into more complex objectives. There's a reason intro avalanche courses focus on teaching the difference between simple and complex terrain. If we're in simple terrain, you can make a mistake and hopefully walk away with a wrist slap. Complex terrain, you make a mistake and that mistake could cost your life. Remember to try and be honest with yourself about the types of objectives you should be doing at your skill and knowledge level, but also put yourself in the hot seat too. Break trail, speak up, and back off if needed. Choose objectives where you can challenge yourself and have a pre-plan so you know what to expect. consider the terrain and avalanche problems and constantly reassess. And I think if you will find that despite your uncertainty about doing or going somewhere new, you're going to feel a lot more confident and prepared. So that is the end of my presentation for tonight. And I'd like to thank you all for showing up. I know this was quite a lot to take in, especially if you're new to backcountry skiing. This is kind of a more advanced topic, but that's great. It gives you something to think about. And I hope you guys have some questions. We can put those into the chat. And also really want to thank SheJumps for having me back and helping organize this event. And hopefully I get to see some of you out there this winter.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was tremendous. I think everyone's brains are very full right now. Really, really super info. There are a handful of questions in the chat, so we can use our next, we have about 22 minutes left for tonight's event to start going through those. So starting at the top from Phoebe, we have, what would you recommend for resources to improve map and compass skills? I've looked for classes, but can't find any in my area in Northwest Montana.
Well, I know that SheJumps once in a while does a navigation course, so maybe we can do an online one at some point. But yeah, for map and compass skills, it's definitely if you can find someone to do some teaching with you, that can be really great. The freedom in the Freedom of the Hills book that was mentioned earlier is a great book that does cover some map and compass skills. There's a lot of online searching that you could do, but it can get quite technical. And depending on where or who's teaching your avalanche courses, sometimes if there's enough time, some of the intro courses do touch on that, usually more so in like a AST2 or an RE level 2, is what I've found. But yeah, I think it's a process of kind of trying to, what I find is, yeah, if you can get someone to teach it or learning from some written work, but then also just going out and doing it. And a big part of the process is trying to imagine, when I look at the map, I'm looking at the contour lines, which are representing the 3D Earth, and trying to picture that terrain, and then going out in the terrain and seeing if what I pictured related, and then kind of adjusting what my perception of the map looks like to reality, if that makes if that makes sense.
Thank you. From Hillary, what's your favorite watch?
I mean, I, at the moment, am using Garmin. It's been great. I think for me, what I'm looking for in a watch is an altimeter, and then everything else is a bonus. So the altimeter I use all the time, just knowing my elevation, and having an alarm clock is helpful when you're in your tent. But the Garmin one's so fancy, like it tells me my heart rate and all of those things, but like really what I want to know from it is just my elevation. So I'm just looking for a watch with elevation, and everything else is just added bonus.
Sure. From Bridget, how do you balance the potential risk of having a watch interfere with your beacon signal? I've tended towards wearing one and trying to be cautious about keeping my beacon on the other side of my body, but I never know how much of a risk that really is.
Yeah, that's a great question. So transceiver or beacon interference, when you're transmitting your signal, your transceiver is less sensitive. So, and sorry, I'm Canadian, so we're talking that you need about 20 centimeters to 30 centimeters of separation. So basically about a ruler's length of distance from something that could cause interference. So anything that transmits a signal, or kind of metal objects. And where the interference actually becomes a bigger problem is if you have to search. So yes, searching with your transceiver, if you're wearing your watch on your left hand, trying to keep it about 50 centimeters away is going to be what you're trying to do there. I think, the transceivers are pretty good, and the big thing is to practice with them. Practice with them in places where you're likely not to get interference. Make sure you don't have anything on. You're not wearing heated gloves. You're not got magnets on your coat. Take your watch off. Do your search with that. And then practice somewhere where you would have interference, so you know what interference looks like, so that when that's happening, you can identify it and be like, okay, I'm getting interference. Um, and then how can I deal with this? And I think that's part of the problem, is that if you don't recognize that you're getting interference, you're not going to know that you have to adjust your search strategies for that interference. And so if you recognize it, then it becomes like, okay, well, I'm going to take my watch off and put it in my pack and make sure it's well away from my transceiver, or I'm going to make sure my radio is not in my pocket and my phone is off, not like airplane mode is not transmitting, and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's, I think, a good start to that question.
Thank you. So we have 2 more questions left. So if folks have other questions for Christine, please make sure you're adding them into the Q&A feature. All right, from Kate, what's the difference between a chute and a couloir?
Nothing, just depends where you live. People call them chutes, people call them couloirs. But there's like, so it's like, a pass is kind of like the low point between 2 high points, same with a valley. And then a gully feature is usually going to be kind of quite broad and wide. And then when you get into things like chutes and couloirs, these are narrower gully features on a mountain, generally speaking.
Another great one from Bridget. How do you think about assessing avalanche risk later in the season when forecasts aren't being made anymore?
Yeah, great question, Bridget. I mean, in some ways, like, so we're talking more about the spring. In some ways, our avalanche assessments become a little easier, in the sense that there's going to be the daily freeze thaw, right? So as long as it got cold overnight and you wake up and there's a good freeze on the ground, that snowpack is going to be locked in until the heat actually starts affecting it. And when that happens, that's when that transition is going to change and tip the scales into higher hazard. So, generally speaking, in the areas I live anyways, in the springtime, we're kind of like, we want to be basically on our way back down, heading home through the cruxes by noon in the springtime. So you're leaving really early and you're getting out really early. But if you don't get a good freeze overnight, temperatures stay warm overnight, and you get out there and you realize there's no crust over top of things, that means the first sun that things start to see, that change is going to happen really quickly. And so you might have to back off earlier from something like that. And, a lot of my job is to forecast for places that don't have forecasts. And so a lot of it is just like a way that I like to practice kind of forecasting when you're like just starting out is, before I actually look at the bulletin, I look at all the weather information I can and get a sense of what has happened, and ask myself, look, what's the trend? Do I think hazard is increasing or decreasing or staying the same? What did those weather inputs do? Are they going to cause avalanche problems? What sort of avalanche problems? What might they be? What sort of terrain might I then be afraid of? And what sort of terrain features might I then be afraid of? And then go look at the avalanche bulletin and see what they have said, and maybe they've mentioned something you didn't think of, or maybe you thought of something that's not in there. And that doesn't necessarily mean that what you thought of is not there. It just is remembering that avalanche bulletins are forecasting for very large areas, and you might be thinking specifically about where you're headed that day. And I would keep that hazard on your list. Like if you were thinking that loose snow avalanches are likely and they didn't list it in your avalanche bulletin, but that you go there, and whenever you get this kind of conditions, you always see that, keep that hazard in your mind, kind of thing. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for further reading?
Yeah, I think the Bruce Tremper books, he's got a few. The classic is Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain, and then he has a few more, and they're great reads. They really do a good job of taking technical snow science theories and making them more palatable. And then if you really want to get into like the technical snow science, you could look at something like the Avalanche Handbook. There's the Freedom of the Hills book again that was mentioned for the mountaineering, and then there's also there's like an American series of books that they do a bunch of different mountaineering, ski mountaineering. I'd have to look. But I think the other side of it and is also looking at case studies and just like learning the history of the areas that you're recreating in. A lot of times these avalanches repeat themselves, or we repeat the same, we can learn a lot from other people's mistakes, and knowing that something has happened in an area before is going to help you make decisions because it's then on your radar.
Super. And for that one, I typed the response as you were talking, Christine, so that folks could reference the names of those books.
Oh yeah, thank you.
All right, a question from Lane about beacon positioning on your body. Lane keeps beacon in thigh pocket in bibs to stay away from ribs, but then there's the risk of pants coming off, beacon getting dislodged, or ribs getting broken if worn on the torso. So what are your thoughts about placement?
Oh, this is a good question. It's complicated. There's the manufacturer's recommendations. Most of them say wear it in the harness. Some of them say if you're not wearing it in the harness, then it needs to be in a sewn in pocket. So what that means is if you're not going to wear it in the harness, where you attach the lanyard to your pants cannot be on the zipper on the outside of your pocket, because then that zipper can come open and fly out of your pocket. And there was actually an avalanche fatality last year where this happened, where someone had it in their bibs and the lanyard was attached to something outside of the pocket. So it was zippered, but then his avalanche beacon came out of the pocket and got smashed and ended up like that. So if you're not going to keep it in the holster, then it needs to be a sewn in pocket where everything can be contained within the pocket. And then the other thing I like to think of is what are you trying to accomplish? So personally, I often do wear it in my thigh pocket because as a guide, I have to carry a radio and I have like all this interference that I'm trying to avoid. So the best way I can do that is by having it down on my thigh. But I recognize that now if I do get buried, you guys are going to be more likely to dig up my thigh before my chest, which sucks. I would way rather you get to my airway before my thigh. So it is something to consider. And yes, not having it on the ribs, but the ribs can be broken. Yes, they could puncture something, but the big thing is keeping that transceiver protected, making sure it can't come out of whatever you're wearing, and then and then it becomes a personal choice of what are you trying to accomplish.
Great input, thank you. We have two final questions for tonight. How is risk management the same or different when touring solo?
I mean, I think risk management is the same all the time. Like you're always managing the risk of you exposing yourself to danger. When you're solo, you have to consider that you are more vulnerable. Yes, you're not maybe exposing someone else to danger, but if something happens to you, no one is there to save you. Maybe you're in a busy area and people come to save you, but that's also being, that's not fair to then assume or put that on somebody else. So if I'm traveling solo, I'm being very conservative personally. yeah, I think, but managing the risk is the same as, like, you're managing risk the same. It's always the same.
Thank you. And our final question of the night is, at what point do you think it's worth taking an avalanche level 2 class? I've had some people recommend retaking level 1 and that being more valuable as a recreational traveler versus taking level 2.
So I'm not sure, Bridget, where you're from, but and I'm not as familiar with the RE courses, that I've never taken them or never taught them, being Canadian. In Canada here, our level 2 course basically goes from you relying on public avalanche bulletins in our AST level 1, and it's very centered on companion rescue, making sure you understand how to identify avalanche terrain, and more or less giving you avoidance as your tool, your main tool for risk management, versus the level 2 where it's like expecting that you've gained some experience, you're possibly leading groups in at least terrain you're familiar with, maybe not in terrain you're unfamiliar with. Like, you would take your friends out somewhere. You aren't always the one in the back. And I don't mean on a fitness level thing. You can be in the back and still be a very active participant in the group. But I just mean as far as, like, you're not just letting everyone else make the decisions. You're actually actively taking part in decision making. Um, and so you're able to maybe forecast a little bit, or so the level 2 then takes it to making you able to forecast for areas. So if you were going on a hut trip or a backcountry camp traverse, and you're not going to have access to forecasts every day, it's going to give you tools on how to make those assessments without an avalanche forecast. It's going to spend more time on snow science. Is a big part of our level 2 course, and then a huge portion of it is learning how to travel. And so we don't actually do very much classroom, if at all, other than like an AM and PM kind of meeting in our level 2s, and it's a 4-day course of backcountry touring. And so I'm not sure if the RE is similar to that, but basically what I suggest for that is, you want to have, and it all depends on how much you get out, but you want to, I don't think you're going to get much out of a second level course if you're not at the stage where you feel ready to kind of be a leader or are participating at leader in the group. If you're still in the stage where you really need somebody else to be kind of helping you with all the decisions, or basically just taking you, then it's probably is better to redo a level 1 if you're looking for more avalanche education. And the other side of things is, a lot of times when we first take that avalanche course, we're so overwhelmed that there's a lot we miss. And so you can, and this is available to anyone. I don't know, again, what the American sites are like, but you could go on to Avalanche Canada, and they have an online AST1 course that is free that you could do at any time as a refresher. And I would highly recommend just going through that in the start of the season. And then, just kind of, questioning the level 2 stuff is like, am I ready to start kind of making my own decisions with a lot less help, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Great, that was excellent info. And who knew about Avalanche Canada's free online level 1 course? That's amazing.
Yeah.
Pro tip to end on. Christine, tremendous job. Thank you so much for leading this class tonight. We're so thankful to have you continue to lead Alpine Development School and be part of Alpine Finishing School. Folks on the call, we really appreciate you joining us and for your support of SheJumps. I'm seeing some chat in online here that people live in the same communities, same towns, so we encourage you to join your regional SheJumps Facebook group, so you can hopefully meet up in person and become touring partners. Please check out our events calendar online and join your regional Facebook group. And also, if you're interested in those fundraising climbs, feel free to reach out with any questions. We'd love for you all to take part of those. So thanks all. Have a super rest of your night and a great winter.
Awesome. And yeah, thank you, Robin. And thanks again for everyone who's come out, listened, and asked questions. And I'm still, if a question pops up, you can find me on Instagram under my name. Just type me a message. I'm totally happy to answer stuff at any time. So love to hear from you. And I hope everyone has a great winter as well.